Okay, we are going to get started. Let me know if you can't hear me. But we are doing logical flaw questions. So let's do a little background. The main thing to remember with logical flaw questions is that the right answer will describe something that the argument does. So if it's not something the argument does, it does not work. And it will also describe something that is a logical flaw. So if it describes something the argument does and it's not a logical flaw, it does not work. So always be checking your answers against those criteria. In that way, they are kind of similar to structure questions because you're looking at the logical flow of the argument to answer it more than the content a little bit. There are also hybrid weaken questions that are very much just like weaken the argument questions, but with a logical flaw focus. So they might phrase things in a slightly different way, and they will typically bring new information in as a way to weaken the argument. So we are going to have a surprise with a couple of examples. We're trying something a bit different on a couple of them, but otherwise it will be very similar to what we usually do, where I will give you a couple of minutes to answer them, and then we will talk about the answers together. So we're going to go ahead and start with a standard. And if you have any questions as we go, feel free to drop them in the chat. Here is our first question. I will give you a couple of minutes. Okay. Music columnists. In recent years, there has been a huge upswing in the number of young people listening to modern jazz music. Survey results indicate that the proportion of young people listening to modern jazz has increased over 600%. Clearly, radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership. We can look at our breakdown. This one's pretty linear. There's some background information about an increase in the number of young people listening to modern jazz. There's some survey to support that. And then there's our conclusion. Radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership. And then we'll go through the answers and test them against our two criteria. A, it fails to consider the possibility that the majority of young people will not begin listening to modern jazz music. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, it doesn't do that, but that's not a problem. So it does fail to consider, but that's not necessarily a flaw. B, it assumes without warrant that the cause of the ongoing decline in listenership of pop music radio stations is the trend towards listening to modern jazz. It does not assume that. C, it ignores the fact that increases in jazz listenership are typically followed by decreases. That is not related to the conclusion, so that's just irrelevant information. D, it presupposes that the increase in the number of modern jazz listeners is not associated with an increase in total music listenership. This is the flaw. They're saying, hey, there's an increase in the number of young people listening to modern jazz music. Clearly, radio stations that play pop music will experience a significant decline in listenership. That assumes that there is a finite pool of listeners that will only listen to one or the other, and that is not a reasonable assumption. And so D, it presupposes that the increase in the number of modern jazz listeners is not associated with an increase in total music listenership. That is a logical flaw that the argument commits. E, it overlooks the fact that modern jazz is similar in many ways to pop music. I guess it does overlook that fact, but that is not a logical flaw. Yeah, why would an increase in the number of young people listening to jazz automatically mean a decrease in the number of total people listening to pop radio stations? Now we're going to do, I think, yes, we're going to do this one. It's a two-part analysis, logical flaw. So I will give you a couple of minutes and then I will check in. Okay. Jamal. In the United States, the average teenager now spends a staggering 3 hours per day on social media, with many spending much more. Our research has found that there is a strong correlation between time spent on social media and rates of depression. Furthermore, social media greatly distracts from students' academic focus and learning, with children's health and futures in such danger. The only reasonable solution to these problems is to ban social media. And Leela, your plan is misguided as you fail to account for the many positive effects of social media usage. It's not only a platform for communication, but also a powerful tool for global awareness and self expression. Moreover, a recent study indicates that responsible social media use facilitates both the quality and quantity of teenagers' friendships. We are going to identify the conclusion in each person's argument because that is important. So, Jamal is saying, blah, 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 here's some information. The only reasonable solution to these problems is, and you fail to account for the many positive effects of social media. So, let's go through our choices. Oh, hold on. I think I have it on the next screen. Ha. So, A does not specify why social media has certain effects. That's not the problem with Jamal's reasoning or Leela's. B neglects to provide evidence that other solutions are not possible. That is exactly the problem with Jamal's reasoning. Jamal is like, here's some facts. The only reasonable solution to these problems is to ban social media, which seems like probably not true. And certainly not based on the argument because Jamal provides no other information. C provides evidence that bears no connection to the conclusion made. Leela kind of provides bonus evidence, but I don't think that that's the flaw with Leela's argument. D assumes that the research cited is flawless. They don't really specifically assume that anywhere. And E fails to undermine the support for the argument it seeks to challenge. That is 100% what Leela does. Your plan is misguided is not a good support for someone's plan being misguided just the way that you feel about it. Leela brings up some other information, but doesn't really undermine any of the support that Jamal offers in support of their conclusion. So I would say B and E, I believe. Yes. And E. What differentiates 3 and 5, in my opinion? Provides evidence that there's no connection to the conclusion made. Leela does provide some evidence that doesn't bear a ton of connection to Jamal's conclusion. And because her conclusion is like, you don't know what you're talking about, this plan is terrible, that is why that's not the issue. Like, see, she provides some extra evidence, but it doesn't, it's not a logical flaw. Whereas she fails to undermine the argument that she fails to undermine the support for the argument that she seeks to challenge. Her whole conclusion is that Jamal is wrong, and then she spends zero time addressing any of his supporting evidence to weaken his conclusion. She just brings up some different evidence. And that is why her failing to do that is the problem with her argument, if that makes sense. But if correlation does not mean causality, how do you mean, Renato? Okay. We will check out. Oh, I mean, yes, that's true. Correlation does not equal causation. So Jamal supports his argument with like his supporting evidence. They're spending a lot of time on social media and it's causing increased rates of depression, or there is a strong correlation between time spent on social media and rates of depression. So his conclusion, I mean, it's not out of whack. It's just a bit disproportionate. And then Leela's conclusion is that your plan is misguided as you fail to account for the many positive effects of social media usage. And then she supports her conclusion. Here are some positive effects. But what she doesn't do is undermine his conclusion at all. That is why. So, like, each of them support their own conclusion with evidence, but her conclusion that your plan is misguided, but she doesn't weaken his argument at all. That is her problem. Yeah, she supports her argument. She doesn't give any evidence about Jamal's argument. So I think that could be a little bit confusing. But if you keep their conclusions separately, like they both kind of support their conclusion, it's just that Leela should weaken Jamal's argument, and she doesn't do that. Yeah. He's like, this is the only choice. And she's like, nah. And then she's like, because actually there's a bunch of positive effects. And then she lists them. But but she doesn't really cover like your only plan isn't the only plan or anything like that. Okay. Any other questions? Not necessarily as far as correlation. I mean, a strong correlation doesn't mean causality because there could also be a strong correlation if the cause and effect were reversed and some other things. So correlation is never causation, but also like you can only go so far. And that's why like you can only go so far to support a causal relationship. And that is why we can strengthen arguments, but we can't perfect them. In in science, they say you can't prove a hypothesis, you can only disprove a hypothesis. So we can weaken arguments and we might be able to destroy them, but a lot of times a weakened answer doesn't. And we can strengthen arguments, but we can never like be 100% sure that some malicious variable won't throw them off. Yeah. Jamal is flawed because he says there's just one solution. Leela is flawed because she says the plan is misguided and there's some positive benefits, but she only lists the positive benefits and she doesn't address what's misguided about the plan. Any other questions? That one was exciting. All right. And then I think our next one is just normal. Okay, back to a normal one. And then I think I have one more of those later on, but I'll give you a couple minutes on this one. Okay. That's helpful, Kim. If you are debating between two, then that can be helpful to let me know just to make sure that we go into enough detail on the ones that you're not sure on. Okay. A recent study found that depression is significantly more common in those who abuse prescription pain medicine than it is in the general population of US citizens. Given this evidence, the author of the study concluded that the abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. This is our breakdown. And also, just a quick note for these logical flaw questions, you can see that the arguments are pretty simple. I guess easy to break down, not necessarily like the answer choices are easy, but just that they break pretty easily apart. And that is good to know because it can help you see like exactly where the gaps are. Oh, we didn't go into supporting evidence very much. What is it missing? That sort of thing. But premise, a study found that depression is significantly more common in those who abuse prescription pain medicine than it is in the general US population. And conclusion, the abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. So there is our cause and effect graphic that I ratchetly added at the bottom for your visual aid. And we will go through our options. The reasoning of the study author is most vulnerable to criticism that the argument fails to consider the fact that most people who experience depression have not abused prescription pain medicine. Most people who have experienced depression have not abused prescription. I don't think that that's correct. What I had down. Yeah, because of the way the cause and effect is laid out. The abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. So this isn't necessarily a problem because if it were true, it could still be true that the abuse of prescription pain medicine is enough to cause depression. B, overlooks the possibility that most people in the general US population will neither experience depression nor abuse prescription pain medicine. That's not really a logical flaw. We are kind of talking about a specific group of people, these depressed people. So people that are doing fine, like who cares about them? That's not what we're talking about. C, assumes that depression and prescription pain medicine abuse are not both induced by physical pain. So it does overlook the fact that something else could be causing both. And that is a problem, especially because of alone. The abuse of prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. That just feels like an overstatement. So, yeah, it is not considering a potential third cause of both. D, neglects to determine whether another psychological disorder, such as generalized anxiety, causes people to abuse prescription pain medicine. We're only talking about depression, and so this is a different thing. They can get their own study. And E, overlooks factors other than abuse of prescription pain medicine that have been causally linked to depression. So, one thing to consider here is that prescription pain medicine can cause depression, and other things can also cause depression. Other things causing an effect isn't necessarily like ruling out your cause. Like many things can cause an effect. We're talking about like here is one potential cause that leads to this effect. And so like people can be depressed for all sorts of reasons. Like whatever, their kid was taken, like in that movie Taken, like maybe they're bummed about that. It doesn't matter. They're not saying prescription pain medicine is the only cause of depression, like across the board. They're saying that prescription pain medicine alone is enough to cause depression. So that isn't a logical flaw. It doesn't discuss every factor, but it doesn't have to. That is an unreasonable standard to hold an argument to, that it would discuss every possible cause of an effect. So I'm thinking C. And then looks like there's discourse. Yeah, the author doesn't control for co-occurrence for a third variable. Yeah. Okay. That is helpful tips. All right. So yeah, these are a little bit different than just straight weaken the argument questions. And that is like the structure flavor to them, that you really have to see the pieces so that you can follow like the point by point logical flow, and the content isn't as important. It's more like this ticks a box here and this ticks a box here, and like what other things are we missing? If the stem had said only. Yeah, if the stem said that prescription pain medicine is the only thing that causes depression, then absolutely you would be a logical flaw there. So when we're not sure about what to choose, multiple reasons or a third reason for a certain problem, we should choose the narrow option, not the generalist one. Honestly, like that's not a bad choice, but the more specific the effect is, I would say, the better it affects that argument. And that is like why a lot of times a trap answer will just be a little bit broad, and or or it will make like a general statement instead of talking about like the specific thing, like whatever. You're talking about a playground and how your kids don't like it, and the general statement would be like, kids typically like playgrounds. Like, yeah, but we're not talking about typical kids or typical playgrounds. We're talking about these kids in this one, right? So the more specific a choice is to a certain degree, and certainly to the degree that it impacts your specific situation, probably the better the fit is. For logical flaw versus weaken questions is the way to think about it, that one, the flaw is something fundamentally wrong with the argument, versus two, weaken questions are about casting doubt on the argument, not fully disproving it. Yes, a logical flaw is a fundamental flaw in the argument. It is like you shouldn't argue that way, is what it's saying. Hey, the way that you're crafting your argument is wrong. Whereas a weakened question is about like you could bring in new information and say like, oh, maybe you didn't consider this thing. But yeah, with a logical flaw question, you're looking for the flaw in the argument. The argument like fundamentally doesn't work. It doesn't hit the right beats of an effective argument in some way, and you're looking for the way in which it does not hit those beats. Yes, you have to find a flaw in the passage. All right, next question. So this is kind of a hybrid weekend logical flaw question because some of the answers are like bonus information, but let's go through them. We recently sent out questionnaires to all 1,000 dentists practicing in the state, asking them which toothpaste brands they recommend to patients. Results showed that 80% of the dentists practicing in the state who replied to the questionnaire recommend our brand of toothpaste to their patients. Therefore, it must be true that more of the dentists practicing in the state recommend our brand of toothpaste to their patients than recommend any other brand of toothpaste. Let's look at our breakdown. They sent this survey out to all the dentists practicing in the state. And of the people that returned it, 80% of the dentists recommend this company's toothpaste to their patients. So it must be true that more dentists recommend this toothpaste to their patients than they recommend any other toothpaste. Okay, in flawed questions, you can consider flawed arguments that involve things that are inferred or not stated in the stem, but if it is mentioned in the premise, you can't challenge that, right? Oh, can you basically so can you consider the implications of things, but you can't challenge the premises? Yes, I would say so. Clarify that for me if I didn't interpret it correctly. But yeah, never argue with your premises, but you can consider some implications of things. That's the logic part of critical reasoning. Let's go through our answers. Which of the following, if true, would point to a possible flaw in the toothpaste CEO's argument? A, the questionnaire was designed in such a way that dentists were instructed to list any toothpaste brands that they recommend to their patients. This is the flaw. Depending on how, this is new information because we didn't know that about the study, but if they just list every toothpaste, I don't know how it is everywhere, but we have 5 toothpaste brands in America Max that are really prevalent. And so if you just listed all 5, Crest and Colgate and whatever, and every dentist just listed the 5 most common brands, which I feel like is what they would do, then yeah, therefore it must be true that more of the dentists practicing in the state recommend our brand. That does not follow. B, if of the 1,000 dentists to whom the questionnaires were sent out, only 700 dentists actually completed and returned the questionnaires. We're basing our conclusion on the people that replied to the questionnaire. So this is a thing that explains a premise, but we don't care about an explanation of a premise. We take the premise at face value. C, because general dentists often refer their patients to see specialist dentists, such as orthodontists, many of the dentists in the state have overlapping client bases. That doesn't really undermine the conclusion. And again, from an American perspective, finite amount of toothpaste to recommend. So I would assume that anyone that goes to any doctor probably doesn't only go to one doctor. D, every dentist who completed and returned the survey was paid monetary compensation for his or her time. So you guys didn't really go for that one, but that is the second most popular. That one almost on the student statistics gets as much selection as A. So I will go ahead and explain that the fact that someone is paid monetary compensation doesn't mean that they lied. It is supposed to suggest that or it's supposed to tempt you into thinking that the survey was not on the up and up, but the fact that it would only be a problem if they were bribing the people that took the survey. If they only paid you if you said one thing, then that would definitely call into doubt the conclusion. But since they paid everyone, it does not. And E, many of the dentists in the state who are not currently practicing, while practicing, consistently recommended a different brand of toothpaste to their patients. We do not care about those people because we only send it out to the current practicing dentists. So like old retired dentists, why would it matter? They're not seeing patients anyway. Let's see. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, if they could pick more than one, then the fact that 80% recommended this brand of toothpaste doesn't mean that it was the most recommended brand. Some brand could have been recommended also 80% or 90% or 100%. Okay, any other questions on this one? Can on option D, it it could definitely be like a moral flaw to compensate survey members. But I think if you're controlling for it, like they paid everyone who returned the survey, there's a certain degree of just like, oh, we're just paying you for your time. But definitely if they paid people depending on how they answered, that would super call into question what the survey said. Um, B is not a flaw in the argument because it is controlled for. So like they sent a survey to all the dentists. No one no one ever sent out a survey that got 100% participation. So there's going to be some people that don't fill it out and return it, but they control for the people that turned it back in when they say the percent of dentists practicing in the state who replied to the questionnaire. So yeah, I also don't know if like 70% out of 1,000 dentists is pretty good. I feel like it is. I feel like that's more dentists than I would have thought. So we can't really say it's not a viable sample size at that point because they controlled for only counting the people that returned it, and also like they didn't really give us a scale of like what's an acceptable sample size. That seems like pretty good to me. All right. Yes, here we go. Yeah, they could just list every brand they do. That really undercuts the conclusion. All right. I will give you a couple minutes on this one. Okay. 3 years ago, to deter drivers from speeding, the city of Montclair began using sophisticated highway camera systems to identify and ticket vehicles traveling over the speed limit. However, it is clear that Montclair's camera systems are not effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles, since in the past 6 months, despite record numbers of vehicles using the highways, the numbers of vehicles ticketed by these camera systems have fallen to their lowest levels since the introduction of the cameras. What's going on? Let's look at our breakdown. All right, to deter drivers from speeding, Montclair began using these cameras to identify and ticket vehicles that are speeding. 3 years ago. Despite record numbers of vehicles using the highway over the past 6 months, the number of tickets have fallen to their lowest level since the introduction of the cameras. And therefore, Montclair's camera systems aren't effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. Let's go through our choices. Of the following, the best criticism of the argument above is that it overlooks the possibility that A, more vehicles using the highways have autonomous drive capabilities, which, among other things, allow a car to control its speed once that speed has been set by the driver. That doesn't mean people aren't speeding. Like, you can set your cruise control to above the speed limit. So that doesn't really fix the argument. B, greater numbers of vehicles on the highways make it more challenging for the camera systems to identify and ticket vehicles exceeding the speed limit. So that's not really, that explains, like, here, let's see. This explains why the numbers of vehicles ticketed by the camera systems might have fallen, but it's not really a logical flaw in the argument. More just like explaining some stuff, explaining a potential cause. C, the drivers of some speeding vehicles slow to under the speed limit when they approach the cameras. Well, if they're not speeding when they approach the cameras, then they're not speeding. And so that would not mean that the cameras aren't working effectively. They can only spot your speed like when you're within their range. D, highway cameras used by nearby towns have worked flawlessly, identifying and ticketing large numbers of speeding vehicles. That doesn't necessarily mean that they work flawlessly in this town. That is it seems related, but it doesn't mean that, like, the ones that we have in this town are working flawlessly. And E, the camera systems on the highways are working exactly as planned. So this city is trying to get people to not speed. That's why they're using these camera systems. They're not using them to, like, write out more tickets. They want people to not speed in the town. If people are speeding less because of the cameras, then they got what they wanted. So it doesn't necessarily mean that, like, the camera systems aren't effectively identifying and ticketing speeding vehicles. Maybe people aren't speeding as much, and that's why the cameras are handing out less tickets. And then the cameras did absolutely work as they were intended to work. Let's look here. Could you reason B is wrong because this reason explains why the argument says the camera plan isn't working? Yeah, it just explains what's going on, and the argument is that the cameras aren't working as intended. That just, like, gives a reason for why that might be the case, which is not a logical flaw. That's just, like, more information. Are there other questions on this one? It was E. So yeah, perhaps the cameras deterred speeding just as they were intended to deter speeding. Why isn't C the answer? Because for C, like, it doesn't matter. Think about it like this. Like, if I speed like 95% of the time, but when I see a cop, like, I slow to under the speed limit, then the cop didn't misidentify that I was speeding because I wasn't speeding at that time. I was only speeding when I wasn't in range, right? And so in the case of C, like, if they're not speeding in the range, then the cameras aren't not working correctly. They aren't speeding when they're around the cameras. So the cameras could still be working correctly. Does that clarify? So this one actually, I would say, is more of a straight logical flaw question than a hybrid weaken the argument question, but it has a bunch of answers that are very like hybridy, that like introduce new information. But the correct answer, E, is actually like fully self-contained in the argument. Like, here's this assumption that these cameras aren't working as intended. But they state that the reason that the city wanted to do this in the first place is because they wanted less people to speed. And so E actually just fits in flawlessly and does not necessarily like bring new information in. Any other? I don't know if there could be traps for the flaw. Question has awakening. There would not be, Diego. So this is kind of like the conclusion versus inference question thing, that they're really similar in a lot of ways, but they aren't going to. There's no situation where they write out like a logical flaw question that's supposed to be like a hybrid and then it gives you a viable like straight logical flaw answer or vice versa. So I understand the concern about like unraveling between the two, but you will never have like two viable answers because that question will be thrown out. Like, they cannot keep that on the test. And for instance, this one has an accuracy of, I want to say like 30%. That's pretty low. So this one's like a pretty challenging question. It's probably more challenging than most that you would run into on the test, because with an accuracy that low, that's why they do the experimental questions. So they can rule out things where there's like a little bit of they aren't clear enough. They really have to have them so clear that like across language and country borders and cultural borders to a certain degree, like people can be in agreement on an answer. So this one's a little bit, the most popular answer is not the right answer. The most popular answer is C, but we leave it in because we like to make you doubt yourself, I guess. Love a challenge. All right, I do have this one. I do have one more if you guys want to give it a shot. Okay. Senator Thompson, the recently proposed bill to regulate protests is a necessary step to ensure public safety and prevent disruption to our cities. To give law enforcement adequate time to allocate resources for crowd control, we have no choice but to require protest organizers to obtain permits at least 14 days in advance. Furthermore, the bill will restrict protests to designated quote unquote free speech zones away from sensitive areas. This way, citizens can still exercise their right to protest while minimizing the potential for clashes or violence. Citizen, I strongly disagree with Senator Thompson's viewpoint on the proposed protest bill. While I understand the importance of public safety, this bill infringes upon our fundamental right to freedom of speech and assembly. Requiring organizers to obtain permits 2 weeks in advance effectively hampers spontaneous demonstrations, which have played a crucial role in raising awareness about urgent issues. Additionally, confining protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas eliminates their impact, as decision makers are unlikely to attend these protests. Let's look at our breakdown. So, the proposed bill is going to require people to obtain permits 14 or more days in advance and restrict protests to designated free speech zones away from sensitive areas. And that way the citizens can still exercise their right to protest while minimizing the potential for violence. The senator's conclusion is the proposed bill is necessary to ensure public safety and prevent disruption. And then the citizen responds, requiring 2+ weeks of notice for demonstrations hampers spontaneous demonstrations, which have been crucial in raising awareness about urgent issues. Confining protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas eliminates their impact, as decision makers aren't likely to attend those protests. The proposed bill infringes upon the right of freedom of speech and assembly, and their conclusion is the senator is wrong about the bill being necessary. So we are looking for a flaw in each argument. A, assumes that historical patterns of protests will continue in the future. So the senator kind of talks about, like, perhaps past protests were a bit of a hassle, but the conclusion doesn't really rely on that, so that's not a flaw in his argument. If the senator was like, all these past protests, like, just continuing with their problems in perpetuity, that would be different, but since his conclusion doesn't really rely on it, then it isn't a flaw. B, overlooks the possibility that decision makers pay close attention to protests that they don't attend. That is a problem with the citizens' argument, because I think that, like, this part, additionally confining protests to designated zones away from sensitive areas eliminates their impact. I think that that's not a crazy sentence, or at least reduces their impact. But then they tack on, as decision makers are unlikely to attend these protests. That isn't really, like, people don't only care about protests that they go to. I think that that's a bit of a stretch. So overlooks the possibility that decision makers pay close attention to protests they don't attend is a flaw for the citizen. C, assumes that there is no other way to ensure public safety than to allocate resources for crowd control in advance. Yeah, there absolutely could be other ways, because the senator is saying the recently proposed bill is a necessary step to ensure public safety and prevent disruption to our cities. Here's why we have to have all this notice so we can have crowd control, and we have no choice but to require protest organizers to obtain permits 14 or more days in advance. So the senator does assume that there is no other way to ensure public safety than to have, frankly, like, prohibitively long notice requirements for demonstrations. D, treats proximity to sensitive areas as the sole cause of violence during protests. It does not. And E, assumes that public safety should always take precedence over the right to protest. Doesn't really say that either. The senator seems to claim that public safety is important, but the senator also says that like citizens can still exercise their right to protest. So according to the senator, they're still getting to exercise their right to protest, plus public safety due to these restrictions. So I would say senator is C and citizen is B. Yes. Awesome. And we mostly, looks like a lot of agreement on that one. All right. Any other questions on this one or anything else? It is time for questions. Oh, quick tip of the day. Pay close attention to like what's being said. I feel like I've been getting a lot of questions about that. I answer the questions on the chat sometimes, and someone sent me one that was like, hey, can't you actually calculate this number? And I was like, no, because after the first 2 sentences, it gives you a bunch of reasons for why you can't calculate the number and it's unsolvable. And they were like, oh, I started solving like after reading the first 2 sentences and didn't read the rest. And I was like, that's something you should watch out for, because you have to be careful about what's being said to answer the question. They're so picky about word usage on the GMAT. What's the main difference between the flaws questions and weaken the argument questions? So flaws questions are just a bit structury, and there is some overlap, but the main thing I would say to keep in mind about weaken the argument questions is that you are just calling something into question, like a little bit, like whatever weakens the argument the most, even if it's not that big of a deal. If it's like 10% weaker and 10% was the most weaker of any of the options, then that's the answer, the 10% answer. Whereas logical flaw questions point to a flaw, which is to say, like, for this reason, that argument isn't sound. And so it's a little bit more like structure based. CR inference questions involving average, weighted average intimidate me a lot. Any CR. So that's a very good example as far as reading what's being written, because like kind of I had talked before about, we had one about a study, and I was like, pay attention to what they say the study covers, and then pay attention to what they say like they controlled for. Like if they controlled for age, pay attention for that. If they controlled for like the one about the thing where they sent out all the surveys and only some surveys came back, but they only factored in the surveys that came back, like pay attention to those sorts of things, because every part of that narrows it down. So if someone says something about averages, like they're saying that for a reason, and it is a way to control for some things. So like an average will control for sample size to a certain degree. If they're mentioning averages, and then later one of the answers is like, if they're mentioning averages between 2 cities, and later one of the answers is like, oh, like city B is 3 times the size of city A, well, they controlled for that. They were talking about averages, not totals. And so it is just another way to kind of narrow down the scope of what's being discussed. And those are good clues to find so that you know exactly how narrow the scope is. But the other thing I would say about math and critical reasoning is that there's not a ton of math and critical reasoning, and most of the math that there is, like I would say 9 times out of 10, you probably won't have to calculate anything. And on the 10th time, if you do have to calculate something, it won't be very complicated. Like you might have to like do some scratch pad math. Like it might not be just straight up mental math, but it won't be very hard. And so if you're looking at something and it seems like really intimidating math, then you're probably like missing a key or overthinking it somewhere, because look at how long this question is. Like you have 2 minutes a question. This is so long. They're not also going to make you like parse a formula and then like jot out like 2 minutes of math. That's too high of an expectation. Yeah, it's a hard habit to break. But that is why I mentioned, like, if they're bringing up numbers, just make sure you need those numbers. And sometimes you will, absolutely. But most of the time, it's just a distraction to make you see something and then start like, oh, now your focus is over here. For sure. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah. I will see you next week, probably Wednesday. This one got rearranged for some sort of marketing reason, but probably Wednesday morning for me. Thank you all so much.